All right, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Danny Plauger. I'm the Executive Director of Virginians for High Speed Rail. Thanks to everyone for participating in today's webinar, The History of Modern Passenger Rail, How Did We Get Here? The purpose of our virtual town hall series is to give Virginians and our supporters an opportunity to hear from and engage with the leading transportation decision makers and thinkers in the room today. The town hall series is made possible at no cost to our participants through the generous support of our sponsors, Siemens Mobility, JBG Smith, and WSP. Thank you all for your support. One bit of housekeeping, please send your questions via the chat box, and we'll address them to the speakers later in the program at the community questions section. And know that the program will also be posted on YouTube later next week. For those who are unfamiliar with VHSR, we were founded in the 1990s by leaders in Richmond and Hampton Roads to build grassroots support for the Southeast High-Speed Rail Corridor and to educate and advocate for the expansion of fast, frequent, and reliable passenger rail service. Today, we're going to have a unique conversation, doing a little bit of looking back to look forward, and now is the perfect time to have this conversation. Transportation and rail, in particular, are changing. Think about this. Over the last 5 years, freight tonnage moved by our railroads has declined 13%, primarily driven by the reduction in coal traffic, while at the same time, the number of abandoned rail miles in the Commonwealth has increased by nearly 33%. And over the last decade, rail's market share of total ton miles of freight moved has decreased from 35% to 27%, while trucking's market cap has increased from 38% to 46%. And we've all seen the news lately with the labor issues and workforce challenges facing the freight rail industry today. Over the last decade, they've lost a quarter of their workforce, and the workload per railroader has increased by 11%. On the other side of the coin, we see a real resurgence of passenger rail. Before the pandemic, Amtrak's ridership for the decade was trending 4 to 6% higher, but COVID sent everything into a downward spiral. However, there's a lot of positive momentum lately. Amtrak ended the 2022 fiscal year in September at about 71% of their pre-pandemic ridership. In October, their ridership was 83% of pre-pandemic levels. October was also the highest ridership October in Virginia's regional trains, following the back of August, which was our highest ridership month ever for Virginia's state-sponsored Amtrak services. Couple that with the historic investment in the passenger rail through the Federal Infrastructure and Investment in Jobs Act, and it seems that Amtrak and passenger rail really are positioned to no longer be, to use a word from Jeff, transportation's orphan. This afternoon, we have two fantastic speakers who literally wrote the books on Amtrak's history and rail advocacy in Virginia to discuss how did we get here and what lessons should be learned moving forward. Now I have the pleasure of introducing our speakers, Jeff Darbee and Michael Testerman. Jeff is retired from a 42-year career in historic preservation, first as a professional staff member for the State Historic Preservation Office of Ohio, and then as a preservation consultant with his wife, Nancy, from 1980 to 2016. He has authored or co-authored numerous books on historic architecture and railroads, including Architecture Columbus, the American Institute of Architects Guide to Columbus, the Columbus Union Station titled Taking Cars, Annapolis Union and Belt Railroads books, as well as Amtrak, America's Railroad, co-written with co-authors Eugene Harmon and Jeff Darbee. He has also worked on camera for several years as a host for segments of Columbia's Neighborhood, a series broadcast by his local PBS affiliate. And he also writes a history and architecture column for Columbus Monthly. Michael Testerman grew up in the railroad city of Roanoke, Virginia. He graduated from Virginia Tech in 1971 and moved to Richmond for a 30-year career in social work. Michael's rail advocacy sojourn began in 1975 when he helped several counties in Southwest Virginia in their failed attempt to retain their branch line services on the heels of the OPEC oil embargo. In 1980, he was one of the founders of the Virginia Association of Railroad Patrons, and he served as its president until its recent merger with VHSR. In 2001, Michael took early retirement to devote himself full-time to rail advocacy, and in 2003, he helped establish the grassroots coalition known as Rail Solution to promote viable rail alternatives to the proposed supersizing of Interstate I-81 here in Virginia. Michael is also a board member of VHSR and serves as its treasurer, as well as executive director of the Virginia Rail Policy Institute. and he's a Virginia delegate on the Council of Representatives for the Rail Passengers Association. Woo! Now I get to turn it over to Jeff to give his thoughts on how did we get here and where are we going. Jeff, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thanks very much, Danny. I appreciate being asked to be on board. I have the benefit of being old enough that I'm from the pre-Amtrak era. I was late to that era, but because I went to college at Lake Forest College, north of Chicago, and there I met Gene Harmon, co-author with the book with me. We were able to do a lot of exploration of railroading around Chicago, particularly passenger railroading. So I have the perspective of having seen train riding, let's call it, or rail travel prior to Amtrak, and then of course being around for Amtrak itself and following it over the last 50 years. It's been quite an adventure. How I cast things is I'm going to avoid getting too nostalgic. Now in the book, and I'll give a shout out here not only to Gene, my friend Gene, who did a detailed study of state-supported programs of Amtrak. That's an appendix to the book. And then Jeff Darbee, who's well known in the railroad publishing field. He has 29 books to his credit, focusing primarily on railroad facilities, but also on post-war passenger trains, kind of the golden era after World War II, when the railroads really invested in a lot of equipment, expecting a return to the rails based on the surge in rail travel during the war, which logically happened. We didn't have the interstate highway system. We didn't have the airway system we have now. Of course, the rails carried so much of the wartime traffic. But of course, the management of railroads misread, what was happening. They couldn't foresee the interstate highway system that hadn't come about yet. Although conquering Germany exposed us to the autobahns that Germany was already building. So I guess you could see America picking up on that idea. So what we explored in the book, we went at some length to explain how it used to be, not as a nostalgia thing, but to understand why railroad travel developed as it did. It was from the time railroads began, that was part of their business. Part of the business was carrying people from place to place, and it grew in complexity and extent and quality over time until by the early 20th century, the railroad network in the United States was largely in place. Most places in the country, even tiny ones, had some sort of rail service. And what you found, of course, was as highway technology developed, even in the early 20th century, especially after about 1916 with the Good Roads movement, where you began to see actual paved highways that weren't ruts of mud during the wintertime, and with the development of automotive technology, you began to see a real change in railroad travel. Partly too because of the growth of the interurban system, the electric interurbans that preceded the highway system and were kind of the link between the rutted roads of the pre-highway era and the paved roads of the highway era, and was almost a flash in the pan from both the 1890s into about the 1930s when most of those disappeared. So we wanted to trace in the book what we had and how it worked, and explain how it got into trouble, and then talk about the derivation, the birth, the reason Amtrak came about.
Excellent. Any more? Where do you think we're going, Jeff?
Well, Amtrak began more, it's perceived that Amtrak saved the passenger train, and while that's true, the actual motivation was to save the freight railroads. Unlike today, the railroad companies, the private companies, provided passenger service as part of their business. And the problem was that with the increasing costs of that business as time went on, especially in the post-war era, when they did make this huge investment in new equipment, several thousand new cars of all kinds, to serve luxury trains and workaday trains, there was this enormous investment on the part of the railroads, large and small. And it was becoming increasingly uneconomic to operate passenger trains. The costs of materials and fuel and paying the crews, maintaining a huge network of railroad stations under what was always a heavy tax burden, because every mile a railroad track was taxed, every building a railroad owned was taxed, and they were expected to provide both passenger and freight business services The concept being that the freight services would cover the cost of running the passenger trains. And for a long time that was true. But then as the highway system developed, especially after we got the interstate system, and so much freight traffic was diverted to trucks, especially the shorter haul, higher value cargoes, really began to put a squeeze on the railroads. And some actually went bankrupt. The New Haven Railroad up in the Northeast is sort of the poster child of the railroads really getting into trouble and actually threatening a region of the country. New Haven threatened to shut down completely, but a significant percentage of its traffic was both intercity and commuter rail in what's now the Northeast Corridor, particularly New York to Boston and New York to Washington. The New Haven Railroad only ended in New York, but its trains continued on along the Pennsylvania Railroad to Washington in today's Northeast Corridor. And had the New Haven just shut down, that would have created an incredible transportation mess in the Northeast. So the problem was that there was so much resistance to public support of what were perceived as entirely private ventures that should be able to take care of themselves, the railroad companies. Public support for them it was very hard to overcome the idea of having that. It looked like socialism. And you know how we feel about socialism in this country, or what's perceived as socialism. Finally, the problem was so extreme with the New Haven that public subsidies from the states and the cities that it served eventually came through to maintain that passenger service. Now the freight side continued to wither. We got into the whole Conrail era with the joining of the New York Central and the Pennsylvania to form Penn Central, being forced to fold into it what was left of the New Haven, and then the whole thing blowing up by the summer of 1970. It was clear something had to be done. And the answer was Amtrak, originally called RailPax, the idea that there would be some sort of quasi-public or public entity that would take over operation of the passenger train and relieve the freight railroads of that financial burden. And that's really where it came from. It was perceived as a company that was going to make money. In fact, it was presented as a company that would make money. To get the Nixon administration to buy in and to get Richard Nixon to sign the law, to even to create Amtrak, it had to be in the Amtrak law that it was a for-profit entity. And one of the points we make in the book is that that's always been the wrong way to think about it. When you hear news stories about Amtrak, well, it lost so much money this year, or it's getting more subsidies, or Amtrak can never make a profit. Why can't it make a profit? One of the things we push, and we repeat it several times in the book, probably ad nauseum, but people have got to get this idea. This is not a business. Amtrak is not a business. It is a public service. Just like the Postal Service is a public service, and the US Marines are a public service, and the highways are a public service, it should not be expected to make money because it's a service. It should be run in a business-like manner to minimize the need for funding outside what it generates of its own revenues. But it is a service that people have shown that they want. Look at how much of the lost traffic has already come back after pandemic in the figures you cited. This is a service people in the United States want to have, with some exceptions, and we can go into that. And it should be thought about that way and treated that way instead of having to beg for money year to year. It has no ongoing source of funding. There's no trust fund the way there is for the highways, for Amtrak, and that's something we need to address and something we need to fix.
Absolutely. And here's one of the questions that I always get as a rail advocate, and partially kind of why I found your book so fascinating was, even though you didn't address it in the book, it kind of got my mind thinking, having been asked this question, is we're America. Why does Europe and Asia have this robust, high speed passenger rail network, but we don't? What are your thoughts on and can you answer that question?
Well, part of that is geographic. You know, we have really big distances in this country compared to most European countries, and that can be a disadvantage in trying to institute these higher speed routes, the cost of construction, if nothing else. But there's also a long tradition in the European countries of public ownership of the rail transport systems. That was true in Great Britain, British Rail, British Railways, and then became British Rail. But they did a partial privatization, and they're still trying to sort out what they're doing. And there are occasional crises. Things run pretty well there, but they run into occasional crises. If I recall correctly, it's the rights of way that are publicly owned, and various companies get franchises to run trains on the British system. And I think I'm still correct about that. But you find other countries who've just decided that rather than keep putting much more money into highways, they want to go with a much more efficient system that has less environmental impact. And that's Germany, that's the Netherlands, that's France, that's Italy, almost all of the European countries. And in the rail news network, you see every day new investments being made by the governments of these various nations improving their rail services. And it's something we can't seem to get our hands around here in the United States.
Yeah, and it does seem like and we'll get into this a little bit in the question portion, but we're starting to turn that corner a little bit, I think, here in America with the IIJA and with a little bit more investment. Thank you, Jeff. I'm going to turn it over to Michael for his thoughts and comments. Michael?
Waiting to unmute myself. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks for inviting me to speak, Danny. I'm going to briefly describe the arc of rail advocacy or rail policy influencing from the pre-Amtrak era to the times we live in now, where passenger rail and rail transit have gained public acceptance. And lastly, to the pressing need to scale up all rail services in the next quarter century in the interest of a sustainable carbon-free global economy and to promote a high quality of life. Arguably, the rail industry was to early American capitalism what the internet has been to the modern intelligent technology economy. Rail companies simultaneously developed train technology while building their own infrastructure and organizing the management organizations to run it. The rail mode, in general, held a monopoly on most surface transportation traveling above 15 miles an hour for nearly a century. The public incentivized railroad expansion with stock purchases and land grants, but pretty much left all facets of railroading to the railroad companies as long as they handled basic mobility responsibilities at a fair price. In this atmosphere, the rail mode expanded to tie our nation together in the second half of the 19th century, then modernized. Slide one, please. It modernized into during the first 2 decades of the 20th century as our industrial economy grew. Railroad reform. Let me comment on this. This slide shows a modernization in 1914 by the B&O Railroad as it followed the Potomac River toward the mountains. This is all done with private money before the public took over competition by the road system. Railroad reform characterized early rail advocacy, and this was largely in response to correcting the excesses of the railroad monopolies. The Granger movement rose in response to rate gouging by the railroads, and that led to President Grover Cleveland signing the Interstate Commerce Commission into law in 1887. The inefficient operations of railroads could not adapt to the rapid scaling up of responsibilities during World War I, and that necessitated President Woodrow Wilson to sign the Railway Administration Act, which nationalized the railroads shortly between 1917 and 1920. During the last 3/4 of the 20th century, World War II being the exception, the rail mode lost business and revenues as the publicly funded Good Roads movement and the subsequent interstate highway system diverted discretionary travelers and shippers to the highway mode, the path of most convenience and less hassle, even if it was more costly. The rail industry was trapped in the amber of its 19th century business model, and it was still insisting on owning its own infrastructure to control the territorial franchises, so railroads could compete with each other, while mainstream transportation policy treated them as an ancillary or niche mode. In this atmosphere, rail development end users, agriculture and chemical producers, power companies, and manufacturers all have formed advocacy and lobbying arms to ensure relevant and affordable rail services. The stressed out rail industry finally had to jettison intercity passenger and commuter trains by the 1960s, which led to the rail passenger advocacy groups that we have today. Chicago and Anthony Haswell founded the National Association of Railroad Passengers, acronym NARP, in 1967, prior to the creation of the National Railroad Passenger Corporation, or Amtrak. Next slide. The Rail Passengers Association, as NARP is known today, advocates for passenger rail services, which will connect all of America through period. Through all of its existence, it has focused on keeping Amtrak in existence. Its Washington, D.C. staff has been mostly funded through membership dues. Members have tended to be rail passengers from the states that are already served by Amtrak, and RPA's board members and council representatives have historically been white male rail fans who don't match the demographics of most Amtrak customers. Since Amtrak's inception, groups loosely affiliated with the Rail Passenger Association have established in many states to advocate for passenger rail and commuter services more locally. For the most part, state rail advocates are all volunteer organizations which publish newsletters for their members and coordinate grassroots advocacy activities such as writing letters to newspapers and to politicians. And many of these state organizations were formed to protect or promote specific Amtrak routes. Some densely populated states have advocates for transit and commuter rail as well. The first decades of the 21st century have also seen regional and state governments organized to influence federal policies and funding for rail, passenger, and freight services. The States for Passenger Rail Coalition is comprised of states that have contracted with Amtrak for state-supported shorter distance trains. The Southeast Corridor Commission has organized to reinstate passenger rail along the Gulf Coast. Quasi-governmental organizations such as the Coalition for America's Gateways and Trade Corridors advocate for better rail freight services to ports and inland distribution centers. Next slide. Today, rail advocates are finally able to breathe a sigh of relief that there is now broad public support for rail services, and rail is now ready for more trains. But as the road-based model for surface transportation has reached maturity and the point of diminishing returns, the railroad companies are still unwilling or unable to rapidly upgrade their tracks to handle the new users and the new mobility responsibilities. And passengers and rail advocates in particular are like the dog that finally catches up with the car it's chasing. Now what? We've got all this federal money for rail development. How do we invest it most effectively? We've had some transportation policy reformers who were ahead of their time. Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan legislated the Intermodal Surface Transportation Efficiency Act, or ICE-T, in 1991. Former Federal Railroad Administrator Gil Carmichael's 1999 Interstate 2 proposal envisioned high-performance shared use rail corridors for both passengers and intermodal freight. Next slide. It's now time for passenger rail advocates and transportation officials and elected leaders to pick up where Senator Moynihan and Administrator Gil Carmichael left off. By the way, did you know that when Joe Boardman was FRA administrator, he actually encouraged CSX to develop a rail corridor of the future along the Atlantic seaboard, much like Brightline is doing in Florida. Next slide. Those who have been advocating for diverting trucks from highways onto trains have learned that the railroads we have are not suitable for highway competitive rail service either. Most trucks serve mid-range markets under 500 miles. Today's railroads mainly serve long-haul markets with long, slow, infrequent trains. Next slide. If we really want passenger service that can attract riders and grow with demand, passenger rail advocates need to become rail mode advocates. Our advocacy shouldn't be just about passenger trains. And we certainly don't want to only focus on high-speed rail that flies over middle America. The sooner we think of high-performance rail lines, as we do about the interstate highways, a system serving everybody, the sooner we will get to the relevant passenger service that we want and need. If we're going to invest lots of money to restore and expand passenger train services, we should plan for upgrades that can be shared with premium freight trains. Our investments will be spread out to benefit more end users and will become transformative toward achieving a robust carbon neutral economy. Thinking strategically and at the federal level, transportation planners and elected officials need to map and invest in a national network of upgraded higher speed rail lines that can shoulder 21st century mobility responsibility. This is the role for rail and transit in the 20th century. Rail advocates can help us get there if they adapt to the times. Thank you for your attention. That concludes my remarks.
Thank you, Michael and Jeff. The first question, I guess, would be, recently, as part of the IIJA, the Infrastructure Act that recently passed, one of the key things I think that changed, and beneficially so, was Amtrak's mandate. Previously, their mandate was to achieve a performance level sufficient to justifying expending public money. Basically, what folks always say, Amtrak is a subsidy versus an investment, and then inserting and changing out their new mandate to be to meet the intercity rail needs of the United States, which is much more robust. How do you see that impacting Amtrak moving forward, both from a leadership perspective as well as from a community or public perspective? And I'll start with Jeff, and then we'll go to Michael.
It's a good move. If people are paying attention and understand it, we can make progress. But the media, particularly politicians, particularly, keep thinking the wrong way about Amtrak. That why isn't it making money? Why is it losing so much money? Why are we bothering with this? And it comes too out of this perception that somehow rail travel, and despite all the lessons you can learn from whether it's China or Japan or Europe or wherever, all the lessons you can learn about why this works for countries, why passenger rail can be the future of transportation, they're stuck in this attitude that, well, you know, trains are old-fashioned, we used to ride them, but now we have highways, now we have airlines. It's turning around. Perceptions is one thing, and then political will is another. And before we started the program, we were talking here in Ohio. The news this morning was that Governor DeWine, the Republican governor, doesn't think he's going to sign anything that establishes Amtrak service here in Ohio. There's been a lot of interest in what we call the 3C plus D corridor: Cleveland, Columbus, Dayton, Cincinnati. The tracks are in place, they can be upgraded. There's a lot of support, and in particular this time around, the support is coming from the business community in the towns and cities that would be served by these trains. Usually when the business community wants something, it gets it. But at the top level of state government, you've got the governor saying, I don't think so, this is going to cost too much. I remember back when Kasich was governor, just before Governor Strickland left, who was a Democrat, and this goes back 10 years or so, Ohio was awarded $400 million to institute the 3C corridor and other services. And as soon as Governor Kasich came in fact, he campaigned on giving that money back. He didn't want trains in Ohio. As soon as he became governor, there went the money, gave it back. Other states got it. They were happy to have it. And we really haven't changed since. I mentioned that Gene Harmon put together for our book a really good analysis of state programs, and I purposely included Ohio as one of those states as a failure for never having tried. They never even got started, and it sounds like we're going to get more of the same. So political will is a huge part of this issue. When you have people at the top of the governmental structure saying, yeah, I don't think so. And as I was mentioning earlier, as we were talking before the show started, in downtown Columbus, we are spending $2 billion unadjusted for inflation and cost increases to rebuild the interstate highway system where interstates 70 and 71 and 70 cross each other. And there's a lot of mixing and matching of cars, spending $2 billion. And I don't remember the governor ever saying, gee, I'm not sure we should spend that much money. But come to 17 or 20 or 30 million a year to run passenger trains. Well, that's too expensive. I don't know how you get around it.
And that's less than the cost of one highway lane mile here in Virginia, which is
sure
about $45 million per lane mile to add.
Yeah.
Michael?
One of the most recent lessons I've learned as a rail advocate is that as popular as passenger rail has become lately, it's still secondary or further down on the list of priorities for most of the power structure in the country, both the federal and state level. We're trying to advance passenger trains beyond Roanoke into Southwest Virginia. And to do that's going to require major upgrades because, as one of the pictures I showed, we've got a railroad right-of-way that was built with either slave labor or convict labor in the late 19th century, and it's competing with an interstate highway. And our state, and I'm sure many other states, have it on their long-range plans to keep building highways until somebody tells them not to. So they're conflicted with building rail that can really make a difference and be relevant. And at the same time, they want to keep doing business as usual because nobody's gotten the message to them that, we're going to have to use our resources a lot more wisely. So I think when we say Amtrak needs to make a profit, that's just a red herring to slow down the process of advancing rail's mission. And that's why rail advocates need to be aware of what's really going on behind the scenes. And if we can engage local businesses, local governments, and I think Virginia has done a really good job with Virginians for High-Speed Rail. We get the business community telling our executive level people and our Congress members, no, we really want this. And we may not necessarily want to keep widening roads until they can't be widened any further. So that's the challenge that we're facing.
A couple of things occur to me, the sort of rules of thumb. One is that as long as the rubber-tired interests get everything they're looking for, they're not going to object to funding or priority given to things like rail. As long as they get what they're looking for, they won't fight you. You don't try to take anything away from them. Like, don't try to divert highway funding to rail funding because it's not going to happen. That goes to that issue of who has the better lobby. Sometimes you feel like, gee, do we really need to build this? I mean, we've been watching this thing in downtown Columbus for several years, and it doesn't feel any safer than it was. There are more ramps than ever, and there's more weaving than ever. You begin to wonder whether the whole highway program is really just a contractor welfare program.
Yeah. And here's one of the questions we got from Dave Foster. Sometimes we're critical of Amtrak for the challenges that are sometimes beyond their own control. But he asked, given what they've been given to work with, could it realistically have done much better? And if so, how? Essentially, with the limited resources and the going to Congress every year with hat in hand and the challenges that Amtrak has had over its 50-plus year history, how do you think they have done And do you think they could have done better, given the challenges that they face or have faced historically? And I'll turn this one over to Michael first.
I can bail you out, Michael, if you need it.
Well, I'm going to speak from my role as a council member and former director of the Rail Passengers Association. And I've been watching this play out at the national level for over 40 years. I think Amtrak has done about the best that it could, given that we don't have a culture of rail in this country the way Europeans do. It's almost like we've had to reinvent the wheel every time we develop a new locomotive to pull an Amtrak train faster than 110 miles an hour, or build a station somewhere that's little more than a bus shelter, on a sidewalk next to the tracks. We have so far to go that I really don't think Amtrak could have done much better given its year-to-year funding. It really has been a fight for survival, and I don't think they've had any extra energy left to devote to visioning or communicating a better way of doing it than we've gone about it. One other thought that is trying to escape me, if I can wrestle it back, is the board of Amtrak. And again, the way Amtrak has been statutorily set up, the people who run Amtrak are still at the whim of the executive branch of the United States government. And we just haven't had a passion for passenger rail over the course of its history until most recently. And even now, we're still struggling to see if we're going to get a good board for Amtrak.
When we started working on the book, the first person we interviewed was Bill Vantuono, who's editor of Railway Age magazine. And he gave us a great quote, and it was pretty simple. Railroads are not airlines. But look at how many airline people have been hired as either managers or top-end people at Amtrak because supposedly they know passenger transportation. Amtrak faces a unique problem. Look at the other transportation systems we have in the United States. Airlines, highways, waterways. Those are private enterprises using public rights-of-way and publicly owned facilities. Amtrak is just the opposite. It's a public entity trying to make do running on a private network. That's where the conflict comes in. And part of the issue is capacity. The fact that running passenger trains on the same tracks where you run freight trains introduces unique problems in terms of track capacity. And again, I keep returning to the book, not to try to sell it, but because we have made this point, there's nothing wrong with putting public funding into the private rail network in order to increase track capacity to enhance the passenger system. It'll enhance the rail system as well, but everybody benefits if freight trains are more efficient, and everybody benefits if Amtrak can run more efficient operations and not encounter the horrendous delays it regularly encounters on the freight railroads. And it's easy to say, well, they keep putting these freight trains out in front of the trains, the passenger trains, and they keep slowing down the passenger trains. No surprise that the freight railroads are going to let a container train run when it generates 4 times the revenue that operating an Amtrak train will on the same track will generate. Their bias is going to be in favor of their primary business. But if we put public funding into the pinch points where you've got to make improvements to increase capacity, there's nothing wrong with that. Every time we need a bigger airport, we build it. Every time we need another dam on the Mississippi River to replace it to make it bigger for bigger barges, we do it. Every time we need more lanes on the highways, we build them with public money. Why not enhance the Amtrak and national rail system as well?
Absolutely. And our next question kind of feeds off both of your comments a little bit, and it was a point I thought that was made very well in the book. And so I'll kind of expand the question, which is, do you recommend that states have dedicated rail offices staffed by rail experts and rail users? And I think not only focused on a state like Ohio or South Carolina or Virginia, but also on the board of Amtrak. Should Amtrak's board be filled with rail experts or rail users, as well as should there be dedicated folks within states? And I'll start with Jeff on this question.
Yeah, I'd certainly agree with that. And the Amtrak board needs more rail experienced people who really know how railroads work. I'm not sure the current management does. If you look at some of the things that have been happening, yes, some of it's beyond their control, and yes, there's not enough equipment, but it's not being managed well. It really is not being managed well by current management. I think we need to look top to bottom at top management and see if we can do better and get some people in there who understand railroads. As for yeah, I think every state should have um, some kind of entity that's officially designated to support uh, both passenger and freight rail, but primarily passenger. I mean, we have the Ohio Rail Development Commission here in Ohio, and I see the reports every so often. And you know, it's $112,000 going to this business in Tuscarawas County to build a new spur for its flour plant. Well, that's great. Yeah, that helps get more traffic on the rails and so on. But it dribbles out little bits of money primarily for freight. And I don't recall ORDC saying or doing much of anything about trying to get passenger rail across Ohio. You know, what we have is two trains, the Lakeshore, the Lakeshore Limited, and the Cardinal. The Cardinal's tri-weekly, the Lakeshore is daily, but they pass through Ohio in the middle of the night, and they aren't really a usable service for most people. And we can do better. I haven't seen the political will.
Michael?
At a meeting that Danny and I were on earlier this morning, we were talking about how states, and Virginia in particular, will look at a transportation problem like a crowded highway, and their highway department knows how to address the problem. It's baked into our policy. How you measure the demand, who's responsible for acquiring right-of-way, and the design of the improvements that will be made. And you need that at every state level. And it really needs to be integrated with the people that are already doing transportation. So I don't know if you have a rail division as you do in North Carolina, or a passenger rail authority as we have in Virginia, or a joint powers authority as you have in California. You need to have people who know how to do transportation and how to do multimodal transportation. They need to be at all levels, just like the highway system that we have now addresses mobility responsibilities and sees that they are implemented, you know, when new infrastructure or improvements are needed.
It's interesting you mentioned North Carolina. The upside there is the state of North Carolina owns the railroad and always has, the routes on which it has passenger service. That makes a big difference.
Yeah,
it does. And that's why Virginia set up a means to own rail assets and to sort of insulate them from other interests that would rather turn them into different forms of real estate or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, the hiking and biking trails are fine. And the idea of the whole rails to trails movement was we preserve these corridors for future rail development. I haven't seen it happen a lot, but I suppose that's a possibility on some of these routes.
The next question is, the Corps of Engineers often uses a cost-benefit index to support projects, with a cost-benefit ratio exceeding 1 being a level of acceptance. Is this something that you see that would help the saleability of public for future Amtrak spending if they did a little bit more analysis on their investments?
If you have a reliable methodology for figuring out those figures, I'd go for that. You question, you know, what goes in, what comes out. You know, as you're making that sausage, what are you putting in, and what's coming out? Can you trust the results? You know, I like the Army Corps. Yeah, they take good care of the rivers, but that's what they do. So they're probably going to say, well, yeah, we need to build this stuff. So the results come out that we need to build this stuff.
Yeah.
I can't help but be a little suspicious, but I'm willing to be convinced.
I think one of our problems is that, again, we're so unused to thinking about rail in this country that each time we have a problem that confronts us, we have to reinvent the wheel. We haven't learned how to measure results when we make an improvement to rail. Nobody is for sure. If we build it, will they come? They should be. I mean, it works for highways, but we hold rail to different standards. So we're just on a long learning curve. Hopefully, we'll make a lot of progress on my remaining sojourn in rail advocacy, but it's part of the learning curve that we have to pick up on.
The whole thing of if we build it, will they come is it's a legitimate question, but I think we have some answers, and you, both of you, Danny and Michael, probably can address this. I'm thinking of services like the Down Easter that goes from Boston up into Maine, and how successful that is. The impression I get is that if you build it, they typically do come. Most people, once they learn about these services, do flock to them. I don't know if that's the case on all of the state-supported routes. I know in the study we had in the book, some of the California routes have seen serious declines, and nobody's quite sure exactly what's going on there. But the general, especially with the state-supported programs, I think the general result has been the increasing ridership. You know, you have to discount the pandemic era, and we're not really out of it yet, but it's better. Yeah, if you build it, they do come. I think that's the general result.
Yeah.
Once people discover it.
And we've certainly seen that here in Virginia. The second to last question that I'll ask is, how do we get more rail-oriented people at the top of Amtrak? And he mentioned your book, Jeff, and y'all interviewed David Gunn, and it was clear that he knew from personal experience what needs to be done, but we haven't been there since.
Yeah, that's a tough one. You got to find qualified people, and then you have to persuade them to serve. And that's outside my wheelhouse. I'm not sure exactly how you go about that.
Yeah.
But there are people out there. I mean, I wish we could get Gunn back, but he's hiding up in Nova Scotia where nobody can find him. If Jeff Darbee and I drove 650 miles from Jeff's home near Portland, Maine, to get to Nova Scotia to interview Dave, right after the hurricane that tore apart Nova Scotia. Dave said, "Well, no, I'm fine. I've got a barrel of kerosene, so I'll be okay." And his house is heated by wood fires, and so it was fine. But he's. I wish we could get him back.
All right. So the last question, which I'll answer, which is, will we see the new Aero train sets in Virginia this decade? The answer, I believe, is yes. And we will actually be doing a little bit of a town hall about those sometime in February or March. And so please stay on our list, and we'll have more information about that coming. Thank you again to Jeff and Michael for your time this afternoon and for the conversation. It's been enjoyable, and I thought it was very informative and helpful. I want to thank everybody again for participating in today's webinar. I hope everybody has a great holiday season. And just to remind everybody that this town hall will be on YouTube sometime later next week. So thank you all again, and thank you again, Jeff and Michael, for participating.
Well, thanks,
Danny.
Thanks to both of you. I've really enjoyed it. I hope I sounded reasonably coherent.
Absolutely.
It's been a real pleasure being part of this today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good day.